Have you ever found yourself scrolling through your phone searching for something, anything, maybe that might feel the restless feeling in your soul from time to time? Maybe you add items to an online cart, maybe you scroll through social media, or maybe you watch another episode of that show you're not even sure if you're enjoying anymore. Sometimes we just keep consuming, we keep searching, keep spending time and money on things that leave us just as empty as when we started. A recent study found that the average American spends over 5 hours a day on their screens, often searching for connection, meaning, or just something to quiet their inner thirst. Yet despite having more entertainment, more options, more everything than any generation before us, it seems that we're sometimes more unsatisfied than ever. This morning, Isaiah has something stunning to say about our endless scrolling, our midnight searching, our deep thirst that at times it seems that nothing can satisfy. We've journeyed through Advent watching for divine light breaking into darkness. First, we witnessed God's presence in the furnace with 3 young men who refused to bow to empire. Then we watched as divine breath brought life to Ezekiel's valley of dry bones. And today, as we have lit the joy candle, Isaiah reveals that God's word itself carries light, not as information, but as creative power. This word doesn't just describe transformation, it causes it. Like rain that cannot return to heaven without accomplishing its purpose, God's words creates gardens from deserts and joy out of sorrow. This is light that feeds, that satisfies, and transforms. We know, of course, that every farmer from Nebraska sandhills to the wheat fields of Kansas understands that Isaiah's rain metaphor deep in their soul. Rain doesn't run a credit check before falling. It doesn't ask the soil about last year's yield or demand proof of proper preparation. When those dark clouds build on the horizon, rain falls on the profitable farm and the struggling one, the carefully managed field and the neglected corner of property, the rich bottomland and the poor hillside. I think sometimes about farmers around McPherson County who watch the July thunderheads approaching, perhaps one family's wheat already sold forward at a good price, their neighbor perhaps still digging out from last year's hail damage. But the rain doesn't consult the crop insurance claims or the bank statements. It falls on the discouraged farmer who almost quit years ago and on the one whose operation is thriving. I've seen the look on a farmer's face after that first good rain breaks a drought. There's something deep about the relief in that feeling. Sometimes there's wonder. They didn't earn it. They couldn't buy it. It simply came and it changed everything. You see, this is how God's economy works. Divine generosity falls like prairie rain, not because we've earned it through proper spiritual irrigation systems or some kind of moral fertilizer that we've been using. It falls because that's what grace does. It gives life to whatever it touches. The only question is whether we'll open ourselves to receive it and then let that same generous flow pour through us to others who might be thirsting for the same thing. When we look to this text in Isaiah, we see the words explode with imagery of the marketplace. All you who are thirsty, come. Whoever has no money, buy and eat. This sounds like economic nonsense, doesn't it? What vendor shouts for some broke customers to stop by? Yet God's economy operates on different principles. The Hebrew word that's used for buy here typically means a commercial exchange. But Isaiah deliberately breaks this transactional system. You acquire this feast not through payment, but instead through coming, through responding to the invitation. The prophet confronts our misdirected spending directly. Why spend money for what isn't food and your earnings for what doesn't satisfy? The word that's used here often means to be sated, to have enough, to be full completely. Isaiah knows that we're not just physically hungry, but spiritually starving at times, trying to fill an infinite need with finite things. At times we invest in what promises fulfillment but delivers emptiness. Another promotion that demands longer hours. Another relationship that requires us to be someone we're not. Another purchase that thrills for a few moments and then joins the clutter in our lives. Notice how God's generosity intensifies in verse 7. Because God is generous with forgiveness. This word literally means he will multiply, or God will do abundantly. God doesn't ration forgiveness or calculate how much grace that you've earned. Then comes the rain metaphor. Divine word descends, saturates, generates growth, provides both seed and bread. Nothing is wasted. Everything is multiplied. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, likely understood this passage as describing prevenient grace, God's first move toward us before we even know to look for God. This free feast represents grace that comes before our own response, invitation that precedes our awareness of our own need. Wesley didn't just teach this theology, he lived it out. When his own income rose from 30 pounds a year to 120, he continued living on the smaller amount and gave the rest away. He died with virtually nothing in his bank account, but had funded orphanages and schools and missions across England. Wesley understood that generosity isn't something that we do after we've secured enough for ourselves. It's how we discover that God's abundance flows through open hands, not through clenched fists. For Wesley, giving wasn't an obligation. It was participation in God's life and God's work in the world. He believed that growth in grace and growth in generosity couldn't be separated from one another. They were the same movement of a soul toward God at work in the world. We understand that all the resources that we have are gifts from God, making us stewards instead of owners. We don't give to earn God's favor or purchase blessing. We give because we've been swept into God's generous flow. When God's generosity enters our understanding of human scarcity at times, transformation begins, not just in our finances, but in our entire worldview. We can discover that in God's economy, the more that we give, the more capacity that we have to give. It seems reversed, doesn't it? Right here in McPherson, we know something at times about spending money on what doesn't satisfy. We might watch young families stretching their budgets, choosing between gas and groceries. Maybe we see teenagers anxious about the cost of college, retirees worried that their savings won't last. Sometimes this so-called American dream, it keeps getting more expensive while delivering less joy. We're told at times that happiness comes from success. Security comes from wealth, satisfaction from consumption, and yet we look around and we see that our efforts to treat keep our debts keep growing, our dissatisfaction keeps deepening. Isaiah's invitation speaks directly to our exhausted searching. Stop trying to buy what you can't purchase. Stop exhausting yourself for what evaporates. Instead, come to waters that actually quench our thirst. This isn't about becoming more religious or trying harder to be spiritual. It's about recognizing that what we most deeply need, meaning, connection, purpose, joy, it comes as a gift, not as an achievement. Think about our own church's story. Every time that we've stepped out in generous faith, launching Steps to End Poverty here in McPherson County, funding youth mission trips, our Tomorrow First campaign, helping families in crisis. Every time resources have appeared. Not magically, but through people discovering that giving brings more joy than keeping. Consider a family who decided to give their first 10% even when it seemed financially impossible. Perhaps they later share that something shifted inside them through that act of giving. Not their bank balance, but maybe their anxiety level. Perhaps feeling like they've stopped feeling like they never have enough. Or consider someone who says, I used to think I'd give more when I had more. Now I realize I have more because I started giving, because I shifted the way that I look at the world. That's the Isaiah principle at work right here among our community. When we operate from scarcity, we become smaller and tighter and more anxious. When we operate from God's abundance, we become conduits of that same abundance, being able to share and multiply it with others. Studies show that generous people are happier, healthier, and more connected to their communities. Not because generosity makes them wealthy, but because it aligns them with the reality that everything is a gift. God's generous word still accomplishes what it proclaims today. The good news is that God's generosity has already begun transforming everything. Before we even knew to ask, before we could seek to pay, before we deserved anything, God spread a feast for all the world, for you and for me, and invited us to come and eat freely. God's generosity doesn't depend on your bank balance, your worthiness, or your ability to return the favor. Grace multiplies beyond what we can calculate. Forgiveness flows without rationing. Transformation begins without requiring anything in advance. When you practice generosity, you're not depleting limited resources, but tapping into an unlimited supply. Every generous act connects you to the flow of God's abundance. And here's the surprising thing. Joy actually increases when we give. Not the fleeting pleasure of acquisition, but the deep satisfaction of participating in something that's bigger than ourselves. This is why Isaiah connects generosity to the mountains singing and the trees clapping. Generosity doesn't just change bank accounts, it changes the atmosphere around us, how we approach the world and encounter other people. It shifts the very air around us from anxiety to celebration, from grasping to gratitude. The joy candle that we light today burns not despite our giving, but because of it. Joyful and generosity dance together, each one increasing the other. God's generous word accomplishes what it promises. When God's generosity enters our scarcity mindset, transformation begins to happen in us. Mountains and hills burst forth into song, not because circumstances change, but because our perspective shifts from scarcity to abundance. We can discover that in God's economy, the more you give, the more you have to give. Not necessarily money, but what money can't buy. Joy, peace, purpose, connection. This is the light that's breaking through today. God offers what our soul truly craves, and it costs nothing, but it changes everything. You're already invited. The feast is already prepared. Isaiah's abundance connects with our membership promise to support God's work through our gifts, the commitment to give money as part of our discipleship. So I want to invite you to consider living out Isaiah's invitation this week. Maybe you practice one specific act of radical generosity, not calculated giving from your excess, but something that might require trust for you. Perhaps forgive a debt that someone owes you. Maybe you give time that you don't think that you have to spare. Maybe you share something that you've been hoarding, maybe not money, but maybe encouragement or appreciation or grace for someone else. And then before you give, take a moment to pause. Remember that you're not depleting a limited resource, but joining God's abundant flow in the world. After you give, pay attention. What happens in your soul? Does your anxiety increase, or does your peace grow, or something else? Does scarcity expand, or does joy increase? Maybe you took a look at what you have been giving to God's work through our church. If you haven't set a percentage goal, maybe you consider what it would mean to take one step forward toward proportional giving that reflects what God has entrusted to you. Maybe each morning you ask God, where can I be a channel of your generosity today? As we light the joy candle this morning, we celebrate word that transforms wilderness into gardens, that dead tree sprouting new life, rain falling on parched fields. These point to God's generous word at work in our lives and in the world around us. You don't have to wait till you already have enough to be generous. You're already swimming in abundance, already invited to the feast. This is how light conquers darkness, through overwhelming generosity. Will you pray with me? Generous God, transform our scarcity thinking into abundance living. Help us give like rain falls, freely, abundantly, without calculating who deserves it. Make us channels of your transforming word. Amen.